When Constantinople fell in the hands of the Ottoman Empire in 1453, Europe lost access to one of its most important trading routes to Asia, the Silk Road. As a result, the West no longer had access to Eastern goods such as silk, tea, porcelain, spices, rice, gunpowder, etc. Despite this setback, Europeans sought an alternative route to Asia. This led to the Age of Discovery that saw many great naval innovations, which allowed figures like Christopher Columbus to cross the Atlantic Ocean and reach the American continent. Unfortunately, European arrival into the New World would not be too kind towards indigenous people who were met with violent attempts of evangelization and awful diseases that almost destroyed their entire populace. This is especially true in Latin America during the Spanish conquest in the early 16th century. We can thus ask the following question: what methods of punishment were used on the indigenous people of Mexico after Cortes defeated the Aztec Empire? To answer the question, this video will analyze the historical background of colonial Mexico up until the arrival of the first friars onto the land, followed by some examples of punishments inflicted upon the Mexican indigenous people, which included head shaving and flogging, and finally the decree that would end said methods of shaming. First of all, European colonization of Latin America began after the famous Spaniard Hernán Cortés conquered Mexico by defeating the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II. Cortés first left Spain and sailed to the West Indies in 1504. He would spend the next 15 years of his life in both Hispaniola and Cuba as a notary, a secretary to the governor, a municipal official, and finally as encomendero, all of which provided Cortés with administrative and political experience. All this experience gave him all the intellectual equipment needed to succeed in conquering and colonizing the New World between 1519 and 1521. Having spent more than a decade on Hispaniola and Cuba, Cortés, who had seen the Indian population in the Antilles destroyed as a result of European colonizers, did not want to repeat the same mistake in New Spain. As such, after his success of defeating the Aztecs, he wanted to conserve the Indian population there, as he believed they were the cement on which all the work would be built upon. By this, he referred to the building of a new era of pure Catholics, exempt from European corruption, which was prevalent at the time. It is no surprise that friars would quickly make their way into the Mexican land to begin immediate evangelization of the heathens. In the following quote, author J.H. Eliot recounts the arrival of the first Franciscan missionaries in Mexico 2 years after Cortés' successful conquest. It was in August 1523 that the first 3 Franciscan missionaries arrived in Mexico, to be followed in May 1524 by the famous 12 apostles, headed by Fray Martin de Valencia. The Franciscans arrived with the burning desire to establish in Mexico, still uncorrupted by European vices, a replica of the Church of the Apostles. This quote portrays the missionaries' impatience of building a new Europe that was uncorrupted. It was their chance for a fresh start to build a better church and be as authentic as they could to the Church of the 12 Apostles. Conveniently, the indigenous heathens were the best blank slate they could have hoped for, which meant once converted they would follow a pure faith. Furthermore, during Cortés' time in Mexico, chronicler and chaplain to the Spanish Emperor Charles V, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, wrote heroically about the Spanish conquistador and emphasized his intelligence, whereas Moctezuma was portrayed as naive and cowardly. Sepulveda, inspired by Aristotle's philosophy of lower forms of civilization, explained that the indigenous people of Tenochtitlan, the capital of Mexico, were as children to parents as women are to men, as cruel people are from mild people, and as monkeys to men. It is no surprise that the friars, who were charged with evangelization and administration of justice upon the Indians, modeled their role as arbiters after those of teachers or fathers to their heathen pupils or children, and not after the roles of traditional judges. Even the monasteries in colonial Mexico were equipped with jails to incarcerate indigenous transgressors. It is comical how places of worship that were supposed to bring peace of heart were also jails, which is the opposite of peaceful. The grooming of indigenous people continued to be a recurring theme throughout most of the colonization period in the early Renaissance, especially with the Native Americans and First Nations. This continued well into the modern period with the new imperialism when different European countries fought over Africa, an event known as the Scramble for Africa, for the continent's natural resources. As the Spaniards conquered and settled on new lands, they became more concerned about the treatment of criminals. Back in Spain, the public administration of lashes was the most effective way of shaming members from their lower classes, especially women delinquents, even when charged with minor offenses. Not long after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the common method of punishing indigenous transgressors became head shaving, which was sometimes combined with public whipping, like in Spain. For example, in 1536, two Nahua men, Tacatetl and Tanistetl, were found guilty of idolatry, after which they were sentenced to be publicly whipped and have their heads shaved. Other Indian offenders guilty of speaking openly against Christianity were faced with similar punishments. Around the year 1545 in Yanhuitlan, a town in the Mixteca region, a group of indigenous women accused of practicing divination were also whipped and had their hair shaved based on the orders of a Dominican friar. Two other extreme examples include baptized Indians who were caught for the first time practicing idolatry, or those who were caught a second time being drunk would receive 100 lashes plus head shaving. Another way of shaming was exclusively used on indigenous diviners and local healers who would be tied up to a post in the marketplace and had to wear a crown of thorns the same way Christ did when he was crucified, a type of forced imitatio Christi. It is my belief that such corporal punishments were used to demoralize the indigenous communities. Having long hair was such an important part of Aztec life, just like many other native populations. By shaving their hair and pairing it with public whipping, it was a way to humiliate the people. It was a way to reinforce the Christian way, the civilized way. The shaving of the hair was an act of emotional and mental torture, because it was stripping the indigenous people of their culture. It was a way to make them naked and vulnerable so that their spirits would be broken more easily. But their nakedness could also represent Adam and Eve. The savages would become the blank canvas that the Spaniards needed to reconstruct the godly way of life, free from the corruptions and sins that were happening in Spain. Adam and Eve 2.0, a fresh start. The whipping was the physical torture that would further their goals, a type of both negative reinforcement and negative punishment. On the one hand, the negative reinforcement would allow the Indians to follow the Christian way, and the negative punishment would prevent them from going back to their savage ways, because their long hair could trigger memories of their past culture. So, to prevent this from happening, they had to shave their hair, one of their most prized possessions, the one thing that they still had preserved. The weapon would be a tool used to induce fear, to let others know that if the Indians practiced idolatry, divination, or any other custom related to their past, they would get their hair shaved and would be flogged. As for the healers and diviners who were punished by being tied to a post and had to wear a crown of thorns, the same notion of negative reinforcement and negative punishments were used. The concept of imitatio Christi, or the imitation of Christ, was often used by Christian devotees at their own will to feel the pain that Christ felt. Other devotees were killed against their will, but still in the desire to be a martyr like Christ. But the Spaniards forced such devotion upon the indigenous as a means of a Christian punishment, 2 for the price of 1, get people to obey through a Christian concept. As a result of these harsh treatments, in 1560, the Crown issued a decree that prohibited friars from administering punishments, especially head shaving. The decree banned Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian friars alike from imprisoning and punishing Indians, and also emphasized on the fact that Mexican Indians found head shaving highly offensive. The reason behind their wearing of long hair down to the waist or the back was due to an ancient custom among the indigenous which they regarded as their most significant and venerable ornament. Therefore, the Crown needed to tolerate these customs, especially since they did not violate any Christian precepts. Given that conversion of Indians was a long and difficult process already, the last thing the Crown needed was to terrorize them further. Despite such an important freedom being granted to the Indians, Spanish jurist Juan de Soloranzo Pereira, who endorsed the crown and the decree that appeased the Indians, had an objection to it nonetheless. He warned the crown that it still needed to be wary, and his reasons are explained in the following quote. If the converted Indians wear long hair to take treasure and access this, or some other custom, these customs may rekindle memories of their heathen past, becoming a sign that they never left it behind completely. If this were the case, one should proceed with more severity to eliminate such attachment. As it follows, Pereira argued that even though indigenous people were allowed to wear their long hair because it did not interfere with any Christian morals or precepts, the indigenous could still be triggered by their heathen past, as the jurist called it. He saw this as problematic because if the natives remember their past, they could have an uprising against the Christians to prevent their conversion. Pereira believed that if such a scenario were to occur, the crown would need to use more severe punishments on the Indians to facilitate their evangelization. In conclusion, the history of today's Mexico has known many periods of violence and death. Tensions between the different populations were already high when Cortes arrived on the shores of the Aztec beaches. For example, the Tlaxcalan tribe allied with Cortes because they had disputes with the Cholulans people. The Spaniards and the Tlaxcalans massacred thousands of Cholulans to let the rest of Mexico know they were coming to raise hell. The Tlaxcalans, also not fond of the Aztecs, aided in their downfall alongside the Spaniards. All of this political turmoil allowed the Spanish crown to finally claim Mexico. Then, the years following the defeat of the empire, friars were brought to evangelize the heathens. They used head shaving as a means of shaming the Indians by taking away their reputation, dignity, and pride. They also used flogging to break their souls and make the evangelization process easier for the friars. Finally, the crown, at last showing some empathy for the natives, initiated a decree that would prohibit the friars from shaving the heads and punishing the Indians. However big this accomplishment was, Mexico would only gain their independence from Spain 3 centuries later, allowing for 300 years of more violence, racial inequality, and countless revolts.